Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Calera, Alabama. It was just before dawn on January 13th, 2018, when a neighbor stepped outside and froze. On the pavement near the curb lay the body of 42-year-old Kathleen Dawn West, better known to her online following as Kitty Cat. Next to her was something that immediately unsettled investigators: a green absinthe bottle perched deliberately on top of a cell phone. Within minutes, a call to 911 brought patrol cars rushing in. What looked like a fall, or even an alcohol-related mishap, did not line up with the details. The scene behaved like a puzzle, and every piece of that puzzle would matter. The responding officers recorded the time of the emergency call at around 5 o'clock a.m. The neighbor had not heard shouting, no cars screeching, no signs of a struggle. Yet the sight of a body outside the family home was undeniable. West was found partially clothed, face down, less than a few feet from her driveway. First responders quickly confirmed what they already suspected: she had no signs of life. Paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. As daylight broke, the quiet street was cordoned off. Yellow tape cut through the calm of a suburban block where houses usually looked identical. Families went about morning routines, and nothing this violent had ever been reported. Officers took initial photographs, locked the scene perimeter, and logged every object in sight. The body was transported for post-mortem examination later that morning. From the start, anomalies stood out. The absinthe bottle was not lying casually. It was upright, balanced across the phone. Detectives immediately noted that natural falls rarely leave objects in such arrangement. Inside the West home, nothing appeared out of place. Purses, keys, and valuables were still inside. The front door was unlocked. Their 12-year-old daughter was asleep and unharmed. No signs of forced entry, no signs of burglary. It was a quiet anomaly that forced investigators to consider: if this was foul play, it happened without breaking into the home or taking anything of value. The first working theories remained open. Was it an accident tied to intoxication? Did she fall, striking her head? Was it possible a vehicle clipped her near the curb and kept driving? Or was this deliberate violence staged to look like something else? Officers knew better than to jump to conclusions. Every possibility stayed on the table until evidence ruled it out. The call logs, the scene logs, and the initial statements all confirmed one fact: Kathleen West's last known movements were hours earlier, on the evening of January 12th. She had gone with her husband to a liquor store, returned home, and later that night activity in the house quieted down. The next time she was seen, she was lifeless outside. That gap in the timeline would become the critical frame investigators needed to fill. By mid-morning, detectives from Shelby County and Calera police combined resources. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking who had been awake, who had security cameras, who had noticed anything unusual in the early hours. Negative evidence mattered. Neighbors had not seen strangers. No vehicles were reported speeding away. No disturbances were heard. The absence of noise can be as telling as noise itself. The initial coroner's observation was blunt force trauma to the head. The exact mechanism, whether fall or strike, would need further testing. Toxicology samples were taken to assess alcohol or other substances. But even within those first few hours, the positioning of the body and the bottle began to outweigh the simpler explanations. If it were only a fall, why was the bottle perfectly upright on a phone? If it were a vehicle strike, why no tire marks or drag evidence? Investigators cataloged everything as preliminary evidence: body position, door unlocked, valuables inside, bottle and phone configuration, absence of forced entry, absence of phone activity from Cat after late night. These details became the foundation of the case file. Cat West was not an unknown figure online. With a subscription-based following under the name Kitty Cat, she had cultivated a digital persona distinct from her suburban life. Investigators logged her online presence early, recognizing that in crimes where the victim is visible on the internet, motive could stretch beyond the household. Could this have been the act of a stalker, an obsessed follower? Or was the explanation closer to home? At this stage, the scope stayed broad, but the forensic team kept circling back to what the body and objects revealed. This was not a disappearance. It was not a case where the victim vanished for days before being found. It was immediate, visible, undeniable. And that meant the chain of events from late January 12th into the early hours of January 13th was the critical window. When detectives moved beyond the curb and into the West family home, their goal was simple: document every square foot with precision and identify whether the house itself could explain why a 42-year-old woman was lying dead just a few feet from her driveway. The property was quiet, no forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture. A child was asleep in a back room, unharmed. On first pass, nothing screamed crime scene. Yet the very absence of disruption became its own anomaly. The purse was on a table inside. Keys and wallet were undisturbed. That single fact ruled out burglary as an immediate motive. If this had been an intruder, the open front door offered opportunity, but nothing was taken. It was one of those negative evidences that carried weight later. No missing valuables, no signs of a ransack, no foreign prints found on obvious surfaces. Investigators noted the stillness, the orderliness, and recorded it with the same attention they gave to the body outside. The front door itself was unusual. Officers logged that it was unlocked. For a suburban neighborhood where residents routinely locked up at night, this detail mattered. Unlocked doesn't prove a crime, but in context, it added a layer of doubt about whether the household had been secured the night before. Detectives also confirmed that the home's alarm system showed activity inconsistent with initial statements, though the technical review would come later in lab reports. For the moment, the field notes showed door unsecured, no forced entry, belongings inside intact. Evidence technicians photographed the rooms systematically. The living room, kitchen, bedroom, all undisturbed. No overturned chairs, no scuff marks that suggested a struggle. The absence of visible disruption did not exonerate anyone, but it shaped the narrative away from outside assault. Crime scene investigators often say that a silent room can tell more than a messy one. Here, silence filled the home. Back outside, the scene aligned with the same quiet oddity. The absinthe bottle and iPhone remained the focal point. The upright positioning of the bottle, balanced across a phone, was logged as preliminary anomaly. That phrase matters. It did not yet prove staging, but it told investigators to treat the arrangement as non-accidental until proven otherwise. The street surface around the body showed no skid marks, no debris from a passing vehicle. That fact started closing off the hit-and-run theory that had briefly been considered in the first minutes of the investigation. The victim's clothing was cataloged, partially dressed but not stripped in a way suggesting sexual assault. Negative evidence again. No bruising consistent with restraint, no indicators of sexual motive. This was not a random assault by a passing stranger. The body position itself suggested collapse or impact at that location, not transportation from somewhere else. Every early marker pointed toward the home as the origin of events. While crime scene techs logged and collected, detectives canvassed. Neighbors closest to the West property were asked to confirm what they had seen and heard. The replies were uniform. No shouts, no arguing, no disturbance in the early hours. A dog barking lightly, but no one considered it unusual. One neighbor stated the streetlight near the property was working normally, meaning visibility at the curb was adequate. Yet no one saw the fatal moment. The absence of external witnesses raised the importance of physical evidence. Investigators boxed the bottle and the phone separately, each with its own chain of custody form. The door latch and handle were swabbed for prints. Items inside the home, from glasses in the kitchen to remotes in the living room, were also processed. What they needed was contrast, what belonged and what didn't. The first sweep showed nothing foreign, but the lab would later refine that picture. The coroner's team removed Cat West's body after full documentation. Initial notes: female, 42, apparent blunt force trauma to the head, no firearm involvement, no multiple wounds. The singular nature of the injury was noted. One clear trauma, not a prolonged attack. This detail later carried weight in determining intent. For the daughter asleep inside, arrangements were made to place her with relatives. The child's presence reinforced that if conflict occurred, it happened after she went to bed and did not disturb her rest. Detectives recognized the sensitivity and logged their efforts to protect the child from exposure to the scene. At this stage, the working summary read, clinical, victim discovered curbside, bottle and phone anomaly, no forced entry, house intact, child asleep, neighbors heard nothing, coroner notes blunt force trauma, no suspect identified, no motive confirmed, just a list of details that fit uneasily together. Investigators knew better than to overinterpret. The early phase is about capturing, not concluding. Still, there was a line one detective reportedly said in a briefing that morning. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. He meant that the scene looked too neat, too arranged. Whether coincidence or staging, only further forensics could say. For residents of Calera, this was not just a statistic. A suburban mother, known both for her online persona and her presence in the neighborhood, had died in a way that defied quick explanation. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They cut through the trust of ordinary streets. That awareness pushed investigators to treat the scene with extra care, knowing the community would demand answers. When the first sweep of the house and the yard did not produce obvious answers, detectives shifted their attention to what modern crime investigation relies on most: digital records and financial trails. What a victim does in the hours before death is often written in receipts, device logs, and digital silence. Cat West's final hours were no different. The details that began to surface were not speculative. They were time-stamped, precise, and in some ways, unsettlingly clean. On the evening of January 12th, Kat and her husband had gone to a local liquor store. The transaction was logged in the store's system, producing a receipt timestamp that showed they purchased alcohol late that night. Surveillance footage, although limited, confirmed the purchase. The couple returned home shortly after. This became the last confirmed outing for Cat West while alive. That receipt anchored the start of the timeline. Investigators now had a point to build from, and everything after would either confirm or contradict it. Inside the West home, detectives collected devices. Kat's phone, already found outside with the bottle, was secured. Other devices, including her husband's phone and the home computer, were also taken into custody for forensic review. Analysts later noted that Kat's phone showed no outgoing messages, calls, or activity after late evening, January 12th. The silence was abrupt. For a woman who maintained a strong online presence, engaging with followers almost daily, the digital stillness stood out. Negative evidence is still evidence, and here it spoke clearly. Her online life stopped cold hours before her body was discovered. The West's home alarm and security system offered another trail. The digital log recorded door openings and closings. When investigators cross-checked the log with what family members said, discrepancies emerged. Activity was registered later than claimed. Whether error, oversight, or deliberate misstatement, the inconsistency mattered. Law enforcement flagged it as working evidence, a category that meant it could help explain the timeline once fully verified. Financial records also helped reconstruct the evening. Beyond the liquor store purchase, Kat's financial activity ceased. No further charges, no ATM withdrawals. Investigators were confident that the hours between the store and the moment she was found were spent at home. That narrowed the geography of the crime to one property line, one street. As they traced these records, detectives kept returning to a recurring thought. The data lined up too smoothly. The liquor purchase, the return home, the silence of the phone, the alarm system pings. Each step was neat. Sometimes, investigators noted, neatness was a problem. Real life often leaves messy inconsistencies: a stray call, a neighbor's sighting, an accidental camera capture. In this case, the timeline fit like a puzzle with no missing pieces. That made them cautious, aware that what looks orderly can sometimes be the product of staging or manipulation. The case file also recorded early interviews with neighbors. One confirmed seeing the couple return home, consistent with the receipt time. Others reported no disturbances afterward. No vehicles pulling away, no raised voices in the night. That silence could suggest nothing happened, or that what did happen was confined, controlled, and quick. Detectives examined whether Kat's online following might intersect with her death. Her subscription-based profile, under the name Kitty Cat, attracted hundreds of followers worldwide. Investigators explored the possibility of a fan crossing boundaries, traveling to Alabama, and being involved. They pulled message logs, subscription payments, and interactions from her accounts. The review found no credible threats, no planned meetups, and no one placing themselves in Calera that night. This line of inquiry was cataloged as negative evidence. No stalker, no outsider confirmed. With that, attention turned back toward the household. The digital sweep also revealed a pattern of ordinary life. Kat had texted friends in the days before, engaged online, posted content. She was alive, active, connected. Then within hours, it all stopped. The cutoff was sharp, and it matched the physical timeline too closely to ignore. That moment, when the digital world went quiet, became the point investigators believed something irreversible occurred. By building the case around receipts, device logs, and negative evidence, law enforcement locked down the night's timeline. The liquor store purchase confirmed a joint outing. The return home was verified by witnesses. Kat's phone silence and the alarm system's irregular activity compressed the time frame of her death into a narrow window. If this was a crime, it happened between returning home and the neighbor's 911 call at dawn. The forensic importance of this chapter was not about revealing a suspect, it was about eliminating noise. The theories of a wandering fan, a random passerby, or a late-night errand were all cut down by data. What remained was a small slice of time, a locked geography, and a household where a woman's life stopped. In cases like this, investigators often reflect that digital evidence does not only show what happened, it also shows what did not. No calls for help, no last text to a friend, no attempt to unlock the phone after late night. The absence of those signals carried weight. Kat West's death was not examined in isolation. To understand the crime, investigators and jurors alike needed to understand her life. Victimology is not about judging a person but about mapping their circumstances, routines, and vulnerabilities. For Kathleen "Kat" West, the profile revealed a woman living in two overlapping worlds, both of which shaped the trajectory of this case. Born in Florida, Kat eventually settled in Calera, Alabama, with her husband William Jeffrey "Jeff" West and their young daughter. By all outward appearances, she was a suburban mother, active in her neighborhood, seen shopping, taking care of her child, and living a routine domestic life. But Kat also cultivated a separate identity online. Under the name Kitty Cat, she ran a subscription-based profile where followers paid for access to adult photos and content. It was a legal enterprise, and she was known to have several hundred subscribers. Friends described her as candid, open about her modeling, and proud of the independence it gave her. From a forensic standpoint, investigators saw two contexts. First, her local life. Mother, wife, homemaker in a quiet Alabama town. Second, her digital life. A woman with a growing online presence, interacting with strangers worldwide. Either could have placed her at risk. Detectives began pulling phone records and subscription logs. They identified active users who had interacted with her in the days before her death. Law enforcement agencies across states were contacted to verify whether any subscriber had been physically in Alabama at the time. None could be placed in Calera. This negative evidence eliminated the early speculation that an obsessed fan might have stalked her to her home. Forensic review confirmed no messages contained threats or references to travel. The line of inquiry closed, leaving the focus inside the West household. Those who knew Kat personally painted a portrait of someone energetic but sometimes conflicted. Friends stated she had tension in her marriage. Arguments were not constant but were noted. Family acquaintances told police Kat was independent, and her modeling was a source of both pride and marital strain. Detectives recorded these interviews not as motive but as background, careful to separate speculation from confirmed fact. The forensic focus remained tight. Was Kat's online life connected to her death, or was her death the result of events within her home? With no digital trail leading outward, investigators concentrated on the latter. Autopsy findings provided additional context. Kat had died from blunt force trauma to the head. No evidence of multiple injuries, no sexual assault indicators. Toxicology showed alcohol in her system at the time of death. The coroner concluded she had been drinking but not incapacitated. This was classified as confirmed evidence. That alcohol consumption matched the liquor store purchase hours earlier, reinforcing the established timeline. The toxicology and injury profile raised further questions. A single blow can suggest accident or intent. If accidental, it must be explained by circumstance, a fall, a stumble. If intentional, it requires motive and means. Investigators did not jump to conclusions, but noted in reports that the scene outside, with the bottle and phone balanced, was inconsistent with a simple fall. Crime scene staging was logged as a possibility. In terms of escalation, detectives explored whether Kat's death was a culmination of ongoing domestic tension. Interviews with friends and family suggested disagreements existed but rarely escalated to public confrontations. No prior police reports documented domestic violence. That absence was negative evidence. But as detectives knew, the lack of prior reports does not eliminate the possibility of escalation inside a private home. The child in the house became an important detail. She was asleep, unharmed, and apparently unaware of the events. Detectives noted the sensitivity of interviewing children and deferred formal questioning until child services could be involved. For investigators, the child's safety underscored the controlled nature of the crime. Whatever happened occurred quietly, without disturbing the household. The forensic sequencing now stood as follows. Kat alive late on January 12, 2018, confirmed by liquor store receipt and surveillance, home with husband and child that night. No outgoing messages, calls, or posts after late evening. Found curbside early January 13th, blunt force trauma, alcohol in system, no evidence of sexual assault, home undisturbed, belongings intact, child asleep. At this juncture, the escalation theory became central. The crime likely did not stem from a random outside actor. It arose in the narrow window of time inside a home where only family were present. Investigators understood the risk of misjudgment. As one detective noted in an internal briefing, when the circle narrows this tight, every detail matters more. Kat's dual identity, mother and online model, fueled public speculation once the case went to the media, but law enforcement kept the focus procedural. Her occupation, legal and known, had no forensic link to her death. Her life context explained attention, but the evidence itself pointed inward, not outward. The escalation element was subtle. No violent history, but friction existed. The presence of alcohol, the late-night timing, the household context, these factors framed the environment in which a fatal injury occurred. For investigators, the next step was to test whether that environment could sustain a charging theory. By early 2018, investigators in Calera had built a framework around the circumstances of Kat West's death. They had a precise timeline, a controlled crime scene, negative evidence ruling out intrusion, and a household environment where escalation was possible. The challenge now was moving from suspicion to a prosecutable charge. Charging theory is the point where forensics, legal standards, and prosecutorial judgment converge. The Shelby County District Attorney's Office demanded a case that could survive court scrutiny. An accidental fall, a random passerby, or an unknown stalker all had to be fully excluded before prosecutors would file charges. Detectives began cross-checking every element already logged. The liquor store purchase, Kat's alcohol level, the balanced bottle and phone, the single fatal head wound, and the absence of forced entry. One working theory considered early was that Kat had tripped and fallen against the curb. But reconstruction specialists documented the angle of impact. The wound did not align with a fall from standing height. Preliminary analysis showed the blow came from a rounded object, consistent with the liquor bottle found at the scene. That bottle, while physically present, bore no fingerprints other than Kat's. Forensically, the possibility of intentional blunt force trauma could not be dismissed. Phone analysis also weighed into the charging decision. Jeff West's device showed no outgoing emergency call that night. There were text records to friends earlier in the evening, but nothing after Kat was last seen alive. Negative evidence, no attempt to call for help, no 911, was considered a powerful procedural factor. For investigators, silence in a moment requiring urgency was as telling as any forensic trace. Interviews provided further support. Neighbors reported hearing no disturbance, no raised voices, no signs of a struggle. This suggested a controlled act rather than chaos. Friends who had spoken with Kat earlier in the week said she had not expressed fear of outside threats. Her concerns, when voiced, centered on tension at home. Those statements were logged as preliminary, but when combined with physical evidence, they contributed to the overall charging picture. The autopsy remained central. The coroner's final report listed cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head. Manner of death, homicide. Toxicology confirmed alcohol intake, but not at a level that would explain collapse. That conclusion eliminated accident as a viable defense at the charging stage. Once homicide was confirmed, investigators narrowed the suspect pool to those with opportunity. The timeline showed only one adult present, her husband, Jeff West. Geography reinforced this. Kat was last documented at the liquor store, then returned home. Her body was found steps away from her driveway. No travel, no unknown vehicle, no unexplained movements were ever substantiated. The geography chain ran directly from store to home to curbside. With no outside entry or exit, the case effectively sealed itself around the house. Investigators presented findings to prosecutors. Confirmed blunt force trauma inconsistent with a fall. Object at the scene, green liquor bottle, consistent with potential weapon. No signs of forced entry, no digital trail of outside presence. Negative evidence, absence of emergency call, statements indicating marital tension. Geography restricted to immediate household. Prosecutors asked the critical question, was this murder or manslaughter? The distinction mattered for sentencing and trial strategy. Forensic evidence supported intentional harm, but lack of multiple injuries, lack of documented abuse history, and the possibility of intoxication left room for interpretation. Prosecutors opted for a manslaughter theory, arguing Jeff West caused Kat's death by striking her but without premeditation. This was a charging decision rooted in evidence, sufficient for conviction but tailored to available proof. On February 22, 2018, Jeff West was arrested and charged with reckless manslaughter. The arrest was executed quietly, with media notified shortly afterward. Press coverage emphasized both Kat's online presence and the domestic setting. For investigators, media attention risked overshadowing procedure, but the charge itself rested entirely on evidence. The decision to file manslaughter rather than murder also shaped interagency coordination. The DA's office consulted with forensic experts from outside Shelby County to reinforce credibility. Specialists reviewed autopsy results, scene photographs, and toxicology. Their independent confirmation gave prosecutors confidence. From a case report standpoint, this was the procedural pivot. Moving from investigation to indictment required every weakness addressed. Investigators knew a defense team would challenge the staging theory, question motive, and highlight Kat's online work to suggest alternative risks. By focusing on geography, negative evidence, and the autopsy's blunt conclusion, prosecutors minimized those avenues. This stage also carried a human dimension. Kat's parents attended pretrial hearings, visibly shaken but determined to see charges upheld. They described Kat as loving, devoted to her daughter, and unfairly reduced in media to her online identity. Their presence reminded jurors and observers alike that behind forensic evidence was a family demanding accountability. For viewers following such cases, the charging phase raises difficult questions. When prosecutors choose manslaughter over murder, it can appear like a compromise. But in practice, it is the balance between proof beyond reasonable doubt and the limits of forensic certainty. The charging theory set the stage for trial, where evidence would be tested under cross-examination. For investigators, the handoff to prosecutors was a milestone. Their work had built a case strong enough to withstand court. By the time the case of Kitty Cat West reached trial in late 2020, nearly 3 years had passed since the quiet Alabama street where her body was discovered became a crime scene. The community in Calera had watched the investigation move slowly but deliberately, from the first patrol cars arriving in the pre-dawn hours to the moment when William Jeffrey Jeff West, her husband, was formally charged. Now the case moved into the stage where speculation would be stripped down to evidence, and a jury would decide what the law considered truth. The trial was held in Shelby County. The pandemic meant every seat in the courtroom carried new rules: masks, distancing, plexiglass barriers. Even in those conditions, the gravity of the case remained clear. Prosecutors framed their case carefully, acknowledging from the outset that this was not a premeditated killing, but a reckless act that ended in death. Under Alabama law, manslaughter is defined by reckless disregard for human life, and that was the crime they argued Jeff West had committed. The jury was seated with deliberate care. Each person asked about their ability to weigh forensic science, alcohol use, and marital disputes without bias. Once opening statements concluded, the state began to walk them through the timeline they had been assembling since January 13, 2018. Photographs of the crime scene were displayed on large monitors. Kat lying near the curb outside her home, the green bottle balanced on her phone, the stillness of the cul-de-sac. Prosecutors emphasized how unnatural the positioning was, how unlikely it would be for a woman to simply fall and land in that precise way. Forensic pathologists testified about Kat's injuries. Her blood alcohol level was recorded at 0.23, an amount that impaired balance, speech, and coordination. Yet the blunt force trauma to her head told a different story. The wound was too sharp, too concentrated to be consistent with a simple stumble on pavement. One expert compared the injury to the kind expected from a direct blow rather than a fall. Their conclusion was that while intoxication played a role, it was not the cause of death. The cause was impact, sudden and violent. Digital evidence filled another layer of the story. Kat's phone activity ended late on the night of January 12th, after she had engaged with her online profile. Investigators explained how her presence online was both a livelihood and a source of friction in her marriage. Jeff's phone, by contrast, showed no outgoing activity during the critical window. To the prosecution, that absence was not neutrality. It was silence where one might expect movement. Defense counsel countered quickly, reminding jurors that sleep can create gaps, that absence of activity was not proof of guilt. The defense strategy centered on reframing Kat's lifestyle and the possibility of accident. They emphasized her pattern of drinking, her willingness to walk outside barefoot, her online modeling that sometimes attracted negative attention. They suggested she might have lost her balance on her own, striking her head on the curb without another hand involved. They argued that Jeff had cooperated fully with police, never attempted to flee, and remained consistent in his claim that he had nothing to do with her death. Throughout the proceedings, Kat's online persona hovered like an uninvited guest. Friends testified about her photos, her subscribers, the money she earned through her page. Some witnesses spoke of tension between Kat and Jeff regarding her work. Prosecutors leaned on those accounts to show motive, while defense attorneys argued that lifestyle choices should not serve as proof of homicide. The judge instructed jurors more than once that moral judgment was not their task. Their only job was to decide whether Jeff's actions met the legal definition of manslaughter. The turning point came when jurors saw the forensic diagrams of the Wests' home and driveway. Investigators explained that there were no drag marks indicating Kat had been moved from inside, but the pattern of injury still suggested a deliberate strike. The defense pressed on the absence of blood evidence inside the home, pointing out that nothing in the interior supported a violent encounter. This clash between the lack of physical traces indoors and the unmistakable trauma outdoors became the trial's defining question. Witness after witness reinforced the limits of certainty. Could a fall create such an injury? Some experts admitted it was possible but rare. Was the wound more consistent with a blow? Several stood firm that it was. The legal threshold was not absolute certainty, but proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors reminded jurors of that distinction, pressing that the balance of evidence leaned toward recklessness rather than accident. Closing arguments framed the stakes sharply. The prosecution told the jury that Kat did not simply collapse, she was struck and left to die just feet from her home. The defense countered that the state was asking them to convict without a weapon, without an eyewitness, and without indisputable proof. They called it a tragic accident turned into a criminal case by pressure and perception. Jurors deliberated for hours, requesting to review photographs and reread portions of the forensic testimony. They returned with a verdict of guilty on the charge of manslaughter. It was a conviction that avoided the heavier label of murder, but still recognized that Kat West's death was not an accident. At sentencing in early 2021, Jeff West stood before the court. He maintained his innocence, repeating that Kat's death was not his doing. The judge, however, weighed the evidence, the jury's verdict, and Alabama's sentencing guidelines. The result was 16 years in prison. The verdict delivered closure of a kind, but not peace. For Kat's family, it meant her death had been acknowledged as the result of crime, not dismissed as a fall on a suburban curb. For Jeff's supporters, it left open questions about doubt and probability. For the community, it reinforced a sobering reality. Sometimes crime does not arrive in the form of a stranger in the night. Sometimes it unfolds in the privacy of a marriage, hidden until the moment tragedy breaks it open. As of August 2025, Jeff West remains incarcerated, his appeals unsuccessful. The case continues to circulate in true crime discussions, not only because of Kat's online persona, but because it demonstrates how forensic science, circumstantial evidence, and legal definitions converge. It shows how a jury can navigate uncertainty and still reach a conclusion, and how the line between accident and crime can be agonizingly thin. Kat West's life ended on a suburban street in Alabama, but her story lives on in the questions it raises. How do we weigh forensic science against the possibility of chance? How does a jury decide when evidence is incomplete but compelling? And what does justice look like when the only certainty is loss? When the gavel came down in early 2021, sentencing William Jeffrey Jeff West to 16 years for manslaughter, it closed the trial but not the story. In Alabama, convictions are rarely the last word. Appeals are almost automatic, and for families on both sides of a crime, that means the uncertainty never fully ends. Jeff's defense team filed notice of appeal within weeks of sentencing. They argued the trial court had admitted prejudicial testimony about Kat's online persona, evidence they said unfairly shifted focus from forensics to lifestyle. They also challenged the sufficiency of proof, insisting that the state had not excluded the possibility of an accidental fall. The appeal did not dispute the autopsy findings. Instead, it targeted interpretation, whether the injury demanded a finding of criminal conduct or could still be explained by misfortune combined with intoxication. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed the record. Appellate panels do not reweigh evidence, they check procedure. Were jurors instructed correctly? Were objections handled properly? Was the verdict supported by some evidence? In this case, the panel found no reversible error. The conviction stood. That ruling in 2022 meant Jeff West remained in custody, beginning the long process of serving a 16-year sentence with credit for time already spent in jail awaiting trial. Prison records show Jeff was placed in the custody of the Alabama Department of Corrections. For a man once employed as a campus security officer, prison life marked a stark reversal. Inmates and staff alike were aware of his notoriety. The case had been widely covered by Birmingham news outlets and picked up nationally in the true crime community. Maintaining safety, for him, meant routine transfers and heightened monitoring. Kat's family, meanwhile, tried to move forward. Her mother and stepfather spoke sparingly to press, but when they did, they emphasized 2 points. Kat had been a devoted daughter and mother, and justice, while imperfect, had at least been recognized. They acknowledged the pain of watching her private life dissected in a courtroom. They also recognized that no sentence, whether 16 years or 60, would restore her. Public interest in the case did not fade. Online forums revisited the trial evidence, debating the reliability of forensic testimony, the role alcohol played, and whether the jury had reached the right balance. For many in Calera, the case remained a reminder of how crime can emerge not from strangers, but from the very center of domestic life. Neighbors who had once waved to Kat on her walks or seen her posing for photos outside the home now remembered the flashing patrol lights, the cordon of tape, the weeks of speculation. Law enforcement officials, when asked to reflect, pointed to the challenges of prosecuting cases without eyewitnesses. This was never a case with a smoking gun. It was a case built on fracture patterns in bone, digital silence on a phone, the improbable balance of a bottle on a device. Prosecutors leaned on what they had, evidence that looked too staged, an injury inconsistent with a stumble, and a marriage strained by conflict. Defense counsel argued that every piece could be explained another way. The jury, as the ultimate fact finder, had chosen one interpretation over the other. By 2023, appellate options narrowed. The Alabama Supreme Court declined to review the case. That effectively sealed Jeff's conviction, though his attorneys left open the possibility of federal habeas petitions. Practically, his release date will depend on credits for time served and good behavior. For Kat's relatives, the key milestone was not years left on a calendar, but the recognition that her death was officially classified not as an accident but as a crime. Beyond the courthouse, the case carried broader lessons. It highlighted the role digital evidence plays even when minimal. The absence of activity on Jeff's phone was presented as suspicious. Kat's online modeling, while not a crime in any sense, became part of the narrative of motive and conflict. It showed how modern trials do not exist in isolation from social media footprints. In a world where images and messages create revenue and provoke reactions, those same images and messages can also influence juries. It also raised questions about how communities understand domestic violence. Kat West was not a hidden victim. She was visible, outspoken, with a following. Yet what unfolded behind closed doors remained invisible until it was too late. For viewers today, that disconnect resonates. Many cases in the true crime archive show patterns of control, secrecy, or escalating arguments. This one underscored that sometimes the warning signs are not clear until investigators reconstruct them afterward. By 2024, the case had entered a different phase, one of public memory. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels revisited the story. Some focused on Kat's life as an online figure, others dissected the trial transcripts. But each returned to the same street in Calera, the same pre-dawn discovery, the same question of accident versus intent. The conviction ensured that in the eyes of Alabama law, the answer was resolved. As of August 2025, Jeff West remains incarcerated. His earliest eligibility for parole will still leave years to serve. His daughter, caught between the loss of a mother and the imprisonment of a father, has grown older in the shadow of a crime that reshaped her family. That impact cannot be measured in court documents but remains one of the clearest outcomes of the case. The story of Kitty Kat West continues to circulate not because of sensationalism, but because it illustrates the uneasy boundary between forensic certainty and legal judgment. Every piece of evidence was subject to interpretation. Jurors had to weigh probability against doubt, science against possibility. That process, familiar to every courtroom, is also the foundation of how societies define justice. And justice here came with limits. 16 years is not a life sentence. Appeals failed, but the door remains open to future motions. Families are left with the reality that punishment does not equal closure. Communities are left reminded that crime often begins at home, in moments of recklessness that end in irreversible harm. By the time the courtroom in Shelby County heard its last word on this case, more than 3 years had passed since a neighbor in Calera dialed 911 and reported a woman lying unresponsive near the curb. The woman was Kitty Kat West, 42 years old, mother, and an online model with a dedicated following. The man convicted in connection with her death was her husband, William Jeffrey Jeff West, a former Army veteran and campus police officer. In March 2021, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, Jeff was found guilty of reckless manslaughter and sentenced to 16 years in the Alabama Department of Corrections. He remains incarcerated as of 2025. The timeline had begun with a single pre-dawn call, but it ended in the solemn certainty of a verdict. Investigators had sifted through quiet anomalies, a bottle balanced on a phone, no forced entry, and a home that appeared staged more than lived in. They built their case not on one dramatic breakthrough, but on incremental findings, luminol swabs, inconsistent witness accounts, and the sequence of digital activity that contradicted the version of events Jeff provided. This was not the kind of crime solved by cinematic confession, but by steady accumulation of evidence and expert testimony. The courtroom itself became the final scene. Jurors heard from forensic pathologists who explained the blunt force trauma that caused Kat's death. They heard from digital analysts who traced phone usage and browser activity late into the night. They heard from friends and relatives who painted a portrait of a marriage strained by financial disputes and contrasting lifestyles. Each account added a layer, and together they formed a chain strong enough to withstand the defense's argument that her death was simply a tragic fall. Community response in Calera and beyond underscored how this case was different. Kat was not anonymous. She had a large online presence, and her social media persona, playful, stylized, provocative, became part of the narrative. It forced the jury, the press, and the public to confront how digital lives intersect with private realities. Some defended her right to make a living online, others judged her choices harshly. But the trial clarified that no digital persona, no matter how polarizing, justified violence. In the eyes of the law, Kat was a victim of a domestic crime, and nothing more complicated than that needed to be said. Jeff West's sentencing brought a measure of closure, but it left lingering questions. Could early warning signs have been recognized and acted upon? Could community awareness of domestic disputes have prevented escalation? For law enforcement, the case highlighted the need for blending traditional evidence with digital forensics. For families and neighbors, it underscored the importance of vigilance when tension is visible yet unspoken. As the years pass, the name Kat West continues to appear in discussions about digital identity, online modeling, and domestic violence. Her case is taught in some criminal justice programs as a study in how circumstantial evidence, when carefully aligned, can meet the threshold of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. For her family, however, the academic lessons will never erase the loss. And so the ending is straightforward and unambiguous. Jeff West was convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 16 years, and remains behind bars. Kat West is remembered not for the manner of her death, but as a daughter, mother, and woman whose life ended in violence that could not be excused or overlooked. Every crime leaves behind a trail of evidence, of grief, of questions that do not fade. What the Calera case teaches is that truth emerges not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of details, the careful separation of fact from conjecture. In towns across America, these lessons matter. They remind us that justice, while imperfect, can still hold individuals accountable, and that remembering the victim with clarity and dignity is the final act of respect. Jeff West, convicted of manslaughter in the death of his wife Kat West, is serving a 16-year sentence in Alabama. This case remains a reminder of how domestic conflict can escalate into irreversible crime. Looking back, this case isn't just about a verdict. It's about what happens when silence inside a home becomes more dangerous than anything outside of it. If sharing Kat's story teaches us anything, it's that ignoring tension can cost lives. I tell it not to reopen wounds, but to remind us all to look closer, ask harder questions, and value safety over appearances. What do you take from this? Do you believe justice was truly served? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share where you're watching from or why this story spoke to you. And if you found meaning here, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next crime story that deserves to be told.